Josephine Calloway knew she'd lost the job before her fingers even touched the silver elevator button. It wasn't anything they'd said out loud. It was the silence, the kind that drops like a stone into still water, the exact second she mentioned her twins. She stood in the polished marble lobby of Kensington Holdings on Michigan Avenue, a worn synthetic leather portfolio pressed under her arm, and the rejection sat on her chest like something cold and sharp that she couldn't claw away. Around her, the lobby hummed with the particular cruelty of people who belonged. Designer heels cracking against stone, phones glued to ears, the whole building breathing ambition through its air-conditioned veins, and Josie felt in every aching bone that she was a stain on this world of glass and cold efficiency. She'd watched it happen in real time behind the interviewer's eyes, the polite smiles that stopped short of genuine, the stiff nods, and that barely visible shift in posture the moment she explained 4 missing years on her resume. "My husband walked out when I was 7 months pregnant," she'd said, voice steady but thin as wire. "And I stayed because my children needed me more than any company ever would." A flicker of pity crossed the table, then vanished behind the arithmetic of corporate logic. Because in that machine, gaps meant risk, sacrifice meant liability, and a 27-year-old single mother of twins didn't fit the blueprint for a high-pressure operations role inside an empire whose real power ran darker than any job listing dared to whisper. That morning, her son Theo had looked up at her with his big, serious eyes, breathing slightly rough through the winter cold, and told her that when Mommy got the job, they could finally buy the inhaler that didn't taste like pennies. And beside him, little Margot had pushed her thick glasses up her nose and declared with absolute 4-year-old certainty that Mommy would win because Mommy always wins. Now Josie stepped into the bitter Chicago afternoon, lake wind slicing through her thrift store blazer, and the math she ran every sleepless night started its ruthless loop. Rent 14 days overdue, eviction notice on the counter, Theo's inhaler refill due next week, Margot's eye appointment that couldn't wait, and the money bleeding out faster than she'd ever admit out loud. She'd take anything. Graveyard shifts, scrubbing floors, overnight dishwashing until her hands split open. Anything honest that kept her children fed and sheltered. Then a voice cut the cold air behind her. "Miss Calloway." And there were footsteps, not running, because men like him never ran, but moving with the kind of stride that made the sidewalk feel like it belonged to him alone. If this story's already got you hooked, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to that freezing sidewalk on Michigan Avenue, where Josie turned around and came face to face with the most dangerous man in Chicago. Josie turned around slowly, her eyes narrowing in the weak afternoon sun reflected off the tower's glass panes, and the man in front of her looked as if someone had cut a piece of darkness out of the city's heart and draped it in a tailored suit. He was tall, so tall she had to tilt her head back to look at him, and his whole body gave off a kind of quiet authority she'd never felt in anyone. Not the authority of an executive behind a desk signing off on paperwork, but the kind that thickened the air around it and made pedestrians unconsciously drift aside without understanding why. His face looked carved by a blade, a sharp jaw, high cheekbones, and along the left side of that jaw, a faint scar ran from beneath his ear down toward his chin, lighter than his skin but still clear enough to tell the story of some night he shouldn't have survived. His eyes were what made Josie stop breathing for a beat, gray-blue like Lake Michigan on overcast days, and they didn't look at her the way people look at a candidate who failed an interview. They read her, layer by layer, as if he were turning the pages of a book with his gaze and deciding whether it was worth continuing. Josie realized this was the man who'd sat in absolute silence in the farthest corner of the conference table throughout the interview. The man whose name she didn't know and whom no one introduced. The man she'd almost forgotten existed until this moment. Behind him, about 10 steps back, another man stood frozen, with an expression Josie could only describe as pure astonishment. He was huge, a neck like a tree trunk, shoulders so broad the black jacket stretched to its limit, and he looked like the kind of man born to stand between bullets and his boss. But right now he was standing there with his mouth slightly open at the scene in front of him, as if he were watching the sun rise in the west. 2 young assistants walked farther behind, ties perfectly straight and faces gone pale, exchanging glances the way people do when they've just seen the impossible happen right under their noses. In those few short seconds, Josie understood that even if she didn't know who this man was, the fact that he was standing here on the sidewalk with his tie slightly crooked and the top button of his suit undone was something that had never happened before, and everyone behind him was trying to understand why. He held out his hand, and in it was her worn old faux leather document bag, the one she'd left behind on the conference table when she rushed out in shame without even realizing it. She blinked at it, then looked back at him, and reached out to take it. But he didn't let go. His long, steady fingers still held the edge of the bag, not hard, but with no intention of releasing it, and Josie felt a small current run along her arm, at the exact place where the distance between their fingers had shrunk to only a few inches. She lifted her gaze and looked straight into his eyes for the first time at this distance, and in those gray-blue eyes she didn't see kindness, and she didn't see cruelty. She saw something like restrained curiosity, as if he were wondering about her in a way even he hadn't expected. He said 2 words, "Walk with me." His voice was low, completely calm, neither rising nor falling. But it wasn't an invitation. Josie realized that instantly by the instinct of someone who'd learned to read danger back when she lived with Bryce. It was an order, only wrapped in the softest velvet she'd ever heard, and she knew she could say no, but she also knew her feet had already started moving after him, before her mind had time to decide. They walked along Michigan Avenue in silence for the first 30 seconds, and those 30 seconds stretched like an entire lifetime. Josie walked to his left, her document bag now secure in her hand, yet she held it the way you hold a life ring in the middle of the sea, while the man beside her moved with the steady, unhurried stride of someone used to owning every road he stepped onto. The wind off Lake Michigan blew against them, carrying that damp cold that belongs to the end of winter, and Josie had to clamp both sides of her thrifted vest so it wouldn't flap wildly, while he walked as if the wind didn't dare touch him. Behind them, Hector Vance kept exactly 10 steps of distance, as precise as a line drawn with a ruler, his eyes sweeping over every passerby with the vigilance of an animal long accustomed to guarding its territory. Yet now and then his gaze still flicked toward his boss with confusion that hadn't quite faded. Then the man spoke, and his first question wasn't what Josie expected. He didn't ask about degrees. He didn't ask about management experience. He didn't ask anything a human resources textbook would list as necessary. He asked why, during the entire interview, she was the only one who'd asked about the accident rate for night shift workers. Josie almost tripped on the edge of the sidewalk from the shock of it. She glanced at him, searching for a trace of mockery or a trap, but his face was flat as stone, only those gray-blue eyes looking straight ahead, while somehow still measuring her millimeter by millimeter. He went on, his voice still low and even like water running over rock, saying she was also the only one who'd asked why night shift employees at the company's distribution centers were quitting in waves after only 6 months, while the other 17 candidates, armed with master's degrees from elite business schools, talked only about route optimization, net profit margins, and preferred stock. Josie swallowed hard, her throat dry and raw in the cold. She could have stayed quiet. She could have said what he wanted to hear. She could have played the obedient applicant who knew her place. But she'd already lost this job, and she had nothing left to lose except the truth, and the truth was the only thing she still had the strength to carry. She said that before she had a child, she'd managed a small distribution center for 3 years, not the kind tucked inside a glass tower, but the kind with a tin roof that baked in summer and froze in winter, where she knew every truck driver's name and knew whose wife was due any day and whose kid was about to start 1st grade. She said she'd seen what happened when workers were wrung out and discarded. They didn't just quit. They took their experience with them. They took their relationships with customers. They took the loyalty no amount of money could buy back. And the cost of hiring and training replacements was many times higher than the cost of treating the people you already had with decency. She paused for a beat, then spoke into the open air ahead because she didn't dare turn toward his eyes when she said it. "People aren't cargo, sir." They took 10 more steps in silence. 15 steps, 20 steps. Josie counted each one because she needed something to do so she wouldn't go insane inside that quiet, and she was almost sure she'd said the wrong thing, that he would stop, give a polite nod, then vanish into a gleaming black Maybach, and she would never see him again. But he didn't stop. He spoke, his tone still level, yet something shifted at the edge of the words, so faint she almost missed it, as if she'd brushed against a wound he'd kept covered for a very long time. He said 17 people with perfect resumes and international credentials had sat in that exact chair all week, and not one of them, not a single one, had asked even one question about the human beings actually lifting the freight, driving the trucks, and sweating to keep this machine running. His jaw tightened slightly on the last line, and Josie couldn't tell whether it was anger or sadness or both, But she knew her answer hadn't disappeared into empty air. It had touched something inside this man, something he maybe hadn't even expected to still exist. Then he did the last thing Josie would have ever expected. He talked about his son. There was no warning, no smooth bridge between the story of 17 candidates and the story of an 8-year-old boy. He simply began, as if some latch inside him had clicked open, and even he couldn't control it. His son's name was Flynn, 8 years old, and the boy had stopped inviting him to anything at school 2 years ago. Josie slowed by half a step but didn't fully stop, instinct telling her that if she stopped, he would stop too. And if he stopped, the door that had just cracked open would slam shut forever. He said that 2 years ago Flynn's school put on the end-of-year play, and Flynn had been chosen to play a tree, just a tree with 2 lines, but the boy practiced those 2 lines every night for 3 weeks, standing in front of the mirror in his bedroom with his arms stretched out like branches. And every night he asked if Dad would come, and every night he said he would. His voice didn't change as he told it, still low and flat like a frozen lake, but Josie realized he'd stopped looking ahead and was staring down at the sidewalk, into the space between his steps, as if the story was heavy enough to pull even his gaze downward. He said that on the night of the play he was in Las Vegas, in a hotel room on the top floor, dealing with what he called business, and both Josie and he understood it wasn't the kind of business that shows up in an annual report. He said he'd told himself every night in that hotel room that he was doing it all for Flynn, for the child's future, so his son would never have to go without anything. Then he fell silent for a long time, long enough for 3 people to walk past them on the sidewalk, without recognizing that the man in the expensive suit held half the Midwest's freight routes in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice thinned just a little, only a little, but Josie heard it clearly, because she was someone who'd learned to listen for what people hide underneath their words. I told myself it was all for him, he said, but he stopped believing that before I did. Something tightened in Josie's chest, not pity. She didn't dare pity a man like this, and she suspected he'd take pity as an insult, but recognition, because she heard the pain inside that line, the pain of a father who'd traded presents for wealth, and then realized the child didn't need money. He needed his dad sitting in the audience clapping for a tree with 2 lines. He lifted his face, and the scar along his left jaw caught the afternoon light for a second, before the building's shadow swallowed it. He told her he wanted her to come back. Josie thought she'd misheard, because the wind off Lake Michigan was roaring in her ears. He said it again, more clearly, that he was offering her the operations manager position, a salary twice the number she'd expected when she walked into the building this morning. Real flexible hours, not the kind written on paper and never used in real life. She would leave at 5 in the evening, and not a single soul in the company would be allowed to ask why. Josie went still on the Michigan Avenue sidewalk, the wind still cutting through her coat, but she didn't feel cold anymore because her whole body had gone numb with something she didn't dare name as hope, because hope had betrayed her too many times. She looked at him and asked in a voice that shook so much she hated herself for the tremor. Why me? Not a polite question, not false humility, but a real need to understand why a man like him would chase a single mother down a sidewalk to hand her what the whole world had just refused her. He looked at her, and for the first time since the conversation began, Josie saw the corner of his mouth move. Not a smile, not quite that, but a sign that beneath the ice there was still something that hadn't frozen solid. Because my company needs someone who remembers why we do any of this in the first place, he said, and Josie heard in that line not only a job offer, but the confession of a man who'd forgotten the answer to that very question a long time ago. That night, Josie pushed open the warped wooden door of her studio apartment on the south side, and the smell of pasta tossed with canned tomato sauce rushed into her nose like a familiar embrace. Martha stood at the stove, her faded floral apron tied around her waist, stirring the pot while her eyes kept flicking over her shoulder to watch the twins sitting on the living room floor, scribbling on the back of a grocery store flyer because they'd run out of drawing paper last week. Margot looked up first, her thick glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose like always, and her big eyes behind the lenses lit up when she saw her mother step through the door. Theo looked up right after his sister, his breathing still a little heavy in the apartment's cold air, because the heater only worked at half power, and he stared at his mother with an expression too serious for a 4-year-old, the look of a child who'd learned to read adults' faces before he'd learned to read the alphabet. Josie set her worn old document bag on the kitchen table, slowly, deliberately, letting a pause bloom. Then she looked at her children with the most solemn face she could hold. I think I didn't get it, she said, and her voice was steady enough that she almost believed herself. Margot's face fell at once, her tiny lips beginning to press together, and Theo didn't say a word, but his shoulders dipped slightly, as if gravity had doubled in a single instant. Martha turned from the stove, still holding the wooden spoon, her eyes on Josie with the patient compassion of someone who'd lived nearly 70 years and seen enough failure to know it doesn't kill anyone unless they let it. Then Josie broke into a smile, the widest one she'd worn since the day she first saw her babies through the incubator glass, and she said that her boss had chased her all the way out onto the street to call her back. Margot's mouth fell open, her eyes huge behind her glasses, and then she shrieked in the high, sharp voice only a 4-year-old can make. "Just like in the movies, Mommy. Just like in the movies." Then she threw herself at her mother's legs with all the strength in her tiny body, and Theo ran after her, short arms wrapping around Josie's waist, his face pressed to her stomach as Josie felt his warm, wheezy breath through the fabric of her shirt. Martha stood by the stove, wooden spoon still in hand, and she didn't say anything. She only lifted the corner of her apron to dab at the edge of her eye slowly, then turned back to stir the pasta, as if nothing had happened. But her shoulders trembled, and Josie knew she was crying the way older people cry when they've learned to hide tears inside ordinary gestures. They ate dinner at the small folding table, the 4 of them in the room where the light flickered because the bulb was close to burning out, and the pasta with canned sauce tasted better than any meal Josie could remember, because it tasted like something she'd nearly forgotten. The scent of hope. Late at night, when Theo and Margot were asleep on the single bed the 3 of them shared, Margot curled like a small cat, and Theo lay on his back with one hand on his chest, holding his asthma inhaler close beside him out of habit. Josie lay staring at the cracked ceiling, and for the first time in years, tears fell onto her pillow from relief instead of despair. But even in that moment, when everything should have been perfectly sweet, something stirred deep at the bottom of her ribcage, a nameless unease, like a very faint bell ringing in a dark room when she couldn't find where the sound was coming from. She remembered those gray-blue eyes, the way they read her like a contract hunting for hidden clauses. She remembered how the air around him thickened with a power that couldn't be explained by money and title alone. She remembered the way Hector Vance stood behind him, with the posture of a soldier, not an assistant. And in the dark, she wondered what door she'd just stepped through, because some doors look like an escape but are really an entrance. And once you cross them, the path back is never as simple as turning on your heel. On the first Monday morning, Josie set foot inside Kensington Holdings Distribution Center in the southern suburbs of Chicago. She understood immediately that this place didn't run on procedures or an employee handbook. It ran on fear. The complex stretched out like a small city made of steel and concrete. Warehouse roofs so high they swallowed every echo. Hundreds of trucks lined up in the lot like herds of iron beasts asleep, and everything moved with the cold precision of a machine wound a little too tight. Hector Vance met her at the main gate, the same black coat pulled taut over his broad shoulders, and led her through each area without a map, because it was obvious he knew this place the way he knew his own palm. Every corner, every door, every blind spot the cameras didn't reach. The first thing Josie noticed wasn't the massive scale of the storage bays or the automated sorting lines that ran without pause. It was the way people reacted when Hector walked past. Workers lowered their heads. Not the polite nod coworkers give each other, but the bow of someone who'd learned through hard experience that meeting this man's eyes was not something you did. No one stopped to talk. No one smiled. No one even looked up for too long. They slid aside, made room, then went right back to work with their eyes glued to the concrete floor. Hector showed no sign that anything was unusual, and Josie thought maybe to him this was simply the natural order of the world, like water running downhill and the sun rising in the east. He took her through the loading docks, the sorting section, the packing area, then stopped in front of a long corridor with 3 steel doors at the far end, each with its own electronic lock and its own security camera. "From here on out, you don't need to concern yourself," Hector said, his tone flat and carrying no threat on the surface. But Josie heard what wasn't spoken with perfect clarity. "Don't ask. Don't open. Don't get curious. If you want to keep waking up each morning beside your 2 children." She nodded, her face calm, and she memorized the exact position of those 3 doors, the way someone does when they've lived around things they aren't allowed to know, yet still need to know in order to survive. That afternoon, Josie did something no manager before her had clearly ever done in this place. She stepped onto the warehouse floor, not to inspect with a clipboard and an icy expression, but to walk between the shelving rows, to stop beside each cluster of workers, and to ask their names. Many of them looked at her like she was a strange creature. A few even took half a step back on reflex, as if the question, "What's your name?" could be a trap. But Josie stayed patient. She asked names, asked how long they'd been here, asked how old their kids were, asked whether the night shift wore them down, asking in the voice of someone who actually wanted the answer, instead of someone filling out a survey form. Little by little, a few faces began to loosen. A few replies grew longer than 2 words, and by the end of the day, Josie had memorized more than 20 names, along with at least one detail about each person's family. But the conversation that kept her awake that night wasn't with any of those 20 people. It was with Reggie, a middle-aged man with dark skin, hair threaded with gray, hands hardened from 20 years of unloading freight in the cold warehouse, a man who waited until Josie passed the emptiest corner near the end of the shift, before he lightly tugged her sleeve. He spoke very fast and very low, his eyes flicking toward the ceiling camera, saying that some nights trucks arrived at 2 or 3 in the morning, and they weren't on any distribution schedule, that night shift workers were ordered to look away and not ask what the trailers carried, that someone had asked before. And that person vanished from the employee list the very next morning as if he'd never existed. No resignation letter, no goodbye, nothing at all, just a name erased from the timesheet, and nobody dared mention it again. Josie felt her spine go icy from the base of her skull to her lower back, a cold that didn't come from the freezer bays but from somewhere inside her. Yet she kept her face steady, thanked Reggie with her eyes, and walked on with the even, measured stride of someone who wouldn't let it show that she'd just glimpsed the outline of something far darker than anything she'd prepared herself to face. 2 weeks after Josie started the job, Pax called her up to the rooftop of the Kensington building at 7 o'clock in the evening to discuss staffing strategy, and when the elevator doors opened, Josie understood this wasn't a conference room. This was a private restaurant, the kind with no sign, no public menu, no phone number for reservations, the kind she'd seen in movies and never believed was real. The room sat on the very top floor, with an entire wall of glass facing the Chicago skyline at sunset. City lights beginning to flicker on one by one like stars falling upward, and there was only a single table set in the center. White linen, candles, 2 wine glasses already poured, and a bottle Josie guessed cost as much as 3 months of her rent. Pax was already there, his suit jacket draped over the back of his chair, shirt sleeves rolled up to show strong forearms and a small tattoo on the inside of his wrist that Josie had never noticed before, something that looked like a character she couldn't read in the candlelight. He stood when she arrived, pulled out her chair with the effortless manners of someone taught courtesy, before he was taught how to make people afraid, and Josie sat down in her work clothes that still carried a faint warehouse smell, feeling the distance between their 2 worlds as sharply as the candle glow trembling across the tabletop. They talked about work for the first half hour, about the new rotating shift plan Josie was drafting, about the turnover data she'd collected, about the numbers she presented not to impress but because she truly believed they mattered, and Pax listened without interrupting, without checking his phone, those gray-blue eyes fixed on her in a way that made Josie want to say more and also want to stop, because the intensity of his gaze felt like it had physical weight. Then the conversation slid off the rails of work, and neither of them knew exactly when. Maybe it was when Josie mentioned that many night shift workers took late hours because during the day they had to take their kids to school, and Pax set his wine glass down more slowly than usual. Maybe it was when the candlelight threw a shadow across the scar on his jaw, and Josie realized it was longer than she'd thought, running down closer to his neck, and she wondered who had caused that wound and where that person was now. But whenever the shift happened, by the time Josie noticed, they were no longer talking about staffing charts. She heard herself ask, and she didn't know where the nerve came from. Maybe from the first glass of wine she'd had in 4 years, or from something in his eyes that invited truth, even when his mouth never offered an invitation. She asked why he built all of this. The tower, the empire, the restaurant in the clouds meant for one man to sit and eat alone, while his son didn't want to stay in the same room with him for more than 10 minutes. She knew that question could get her fired on the spot, or worse. And for half a second after it left her lips, Josie felt the familiar cold of regret slide up the back of her neck. But Pax didn't get angry. He turned the wine glass slowly between 2 fingers, looking past her toward the skyline where the city lights blinked like the breathing of some enormous creature, and when he answered, his voice was softer than Josie had ever heard. So soft she had to lean forward to catch every word. "Because strength can't tuck your kid in at night," he said. Josie didn't answer. She didn't need to, because that line didn't require a response. It required a witness. And tonight she was the only witness to the moment. The most powerful boss in Chicago admitted that his strength was useless against the bedtime hour of an 8-year-old child. Dinner ended in silence. Not the heavy silence of the interview when she mentioned the twins, but the strange silence of two people who'd seen each other more clearly than either had planned. Hector drove her back to the south side through streets darkening by the minute, and the whole way no one spoke. But Josie watched the city lights blur through the car window as they left downtown behind, and she thought she'd just had dinner, with both danger and a loneliness so vast, it was almost a thing you could touch, and she didn't know which of the two frightened her more. Josie started changing things from the smallest details, the kind nobody thought needed changing. In the first week, she proposed a new rotating schedule for night shift workers. Not the kind of rotation that looks good on paper, while in reality, it still forces people into 12-hour stretches, but a real schedule that cut consecutive nights down to 3 instead of 6, with recovery days woven in so a human body and mind wouldn't be crushed under the wheels of productivity. In the second week, she had a temporary restroom installed for long-haul drivers. Nothing fancy, just fold-out beds, clean blankets, a hot water tap, and a coffee machine. But for men used to dozing off at the wheel in highway truck stops, it was an entirely different world. In the third week, she submitted a proposal for an employee family support program, including expanded health coverage for children, emergency days off when a child was sick without docked pay, and a free mental health hotline for anyone so exhausted they no longer recognized they were exhausted. Every proposal came with a detailed cost spreadsheet Josie built at 2 a.m. on the small folding kitchen table in her Southside apartment after the twins were asleep. And every spreadsheet proved the same thing: keeping a good worker cost far less than replacing them after they walked away. Not everyone was happy. Preston Voss, the operations director who'd been with Kensington Holdings since before Josie could walk, was the first and most aggressive of the opponents. He was a man in his 50s, with a square face and a heavy jaw, always wearing a white shirt tucked in like a uniform from an era when management meant shouting and employees meant silent endurance. Josie understood from the first day that Preston wasn't just an old operations director losing his grip on power. He was the link between the bright side and the dark side of the empire, the man who managed both the trucks listed on the schedule and the trucks that arrived at 2 a.m. the way Reggie had whispered to her. And Josie's changes threatened both sides at once. Preston pushed back, not by yelling in meetings, but in a way far more dangerous. He quietly delayed every proposal, sent page after page of rebuttal emails to the board in polite language, where every sentence implied that this 27-year-old girl didn't know she was playing with fire. And in every meeting he looked at Josie with eyes that said more clearly than any email that he considered her a threat that needed to be removed. Things escalated to a breaking point at the 4th-week senior management meeting, when Preston rose, slowly buttoned his suit jacket in a deliberate act of challenge, and declared in front of the entire board that these changes were a serious waste of resources, and that a manager without experience at this level shouldn't be given authority to make decisions that affected the entire operations chain. The room went silent. 12 faces turned toward the head of the table where Pax sat, and Josie realized this wasn't the first time this room had waited for judgment from that chair, and it wasn't the first time sweat had appeared on the forehead of the person who dared to speak. Pax didn't stand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shift his posture. He didn't even look at Preston. He stared down at the polished wooden table in front of him as if the words he was about to say didn't deserve him lifting his head. Then he spoke in a low, even tone that was almost a whisper. "Miss Calloway has full authority. Anyone with a problem talks to me. Not a single extra syllable, not a single word emphasized, because nothing needed emphasis when the entire room had stopped breathing." Preston Voss sat down as if someone had cut the string holding him upright, his face gone white, and he didn't open his mouth again for the rest of the meeting. Josie sat there, heart pounding fast, but her face held calm, and in that moment she saw more clearly than ever what she'd only felt in a blur since the first day she stepped into this empire. Paxton Kensington's power didn't come from the CEO title printed on a business card. It didn't come from the rooftop, or the Maybach, or the tailored suit. It came from the pure fear he'd planted in every person in that room by methods Josie didn't know and wasn't sure she wanted to know. And that same fear was protecting her today, but it was also reminding her that the line between being sheltered and being imprisoned can sometimes be thinner than a single strand of hair. One Friday afternoon at the end of her first month, Josie carried the results report on the new rotating schedule up to Pax's office on the top floor, and she heard his voice before she saw him. It carried through the oak door, left slightly open, low and flat as always, but there was something under that calm that dropped the temperature in the hallway by a few degrees, as if every word he spoke came out holding its own negative heat. He was on the phone, and even though Josie couldn't catch every word, she caught enough to understand this wasn't a normal business call. This was the kind of call where the person on the other end was being told exactly what would happen if they didn't comply. The kind of call Josie knew didn't belong in any employee handbook. She knocked softly, but nobody answered, because Pax kept talking. So she pushed the door open and stepped in, then stopped short on the threshold. Flynn sat on the leather sofa in the corner, his feet not reaching the floor because the sofa was too high, an iPad on his lap, his finger swiping out of habit, while his eyes weren't really on the game. He wore a private school uniform, a blue polo tucked into khaki pants, his backpack still on his shoulders, as if he'd been sitting here since school let out, and no one had thought to tell him to take it off. Pax stood by the window with his back to both of them, one hand holding the phone tight to his ear, the other clenched at his side, and he hadn't looked at his son even once since Josie walked in. Josie looked from father to son, then from son to father, and the distance between the sofa and the window was only 5 steps, but it felt as far apart as 2 continents. She walked over and sat down beside Flynn, gently, without sudden movement, the way she always sat beside Theo when her boy wheezed in the middle of the night and needed to know someone was there. Flynn looked up at her, and the first thing Josie noticed was his eyes, the same gray-blue as his father's, but instead of cold, they carried something older and more tired than any 8-year-old should be, and it made pain pinch in Josie's chest. The eyes of a child who'd seen too much that 8 years old shouldn't see, and understood too much that 8 years old shouldn't understand. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't look surprised. He only watched her for a moment, then glanced toward his father, still on the phone in a voice that made the person on the other end shrink. Then he looked back at Josie and said in a tone so calm it hurt, "He's always busy making people afraid. I don't think he knows how to do anything else." Josie didn't answer right away because she was swallowing the hard lump in her throat, and she looked at the 8-year-old sitting on an expensive leather sofa in an office at the top of a tower, his feet not reaching the floor, his backpack still on his shoulders, and she saw that Flynn wasn't angry at his father. He'd passed through anger a long time ago. What remained on that small face was the quiet acceptance of a child who'd stopped waiting for anything different. Pax ended the call a few minutes later and turned around to find Josie sitting beside his son, and for an instant, she read something on his face that looked like surprise. Then it was immediately smothered under his familiar calm. Josie set the report on the desk, but instead of talking about schedules and turnover, she looked straight into Pax's eyes and repeated exactly what Flynn had just said, word for word, not adding and not softening, because she believed that sentence needed to be heard by the right person, and she wouldn't forgive herself if she wrapped it in the padding of delicacy. Pax's face didn't change. Not a single muscle moved, not eyes, not mouth, not jaw, but his hand closed around the edge of the chair and Josie watched his knuckles go white. So white the bone nearly showed through the skin, and he held that grip through a silence. So long Josie counted her own heartbeat 7 times before he finally let go. He didn't say anything to her. No thanks. No explanation. No denial. He only nodded once, short and final, then turned his eyes back toward the window. Josie understood it was a sign for her to leave, and she left. But that night, as Hector drove her back to the south side, she asked one question she knew she shouldn't, whether he was coming home early tonight. Hector stayed silent through 3 intersections, then said in his usual low, clipped voice that his boss had left the office at 6 and driven home, and that it was the first time in a very long time he'd done that. Josie didn't ask anything else, but she closed her eyes in the back seat and pictured Paxton Kensington sitting beside his son on another sofa in some house, silent, not knowing what to say, but there, and sometimes being there is enough before you learn how to do anything else. Another month passed, and Josie began to notice a pattern she couldn't explain with workplace logic. Pax started showing up at the distribution center more and more often, unannounced, no appointments, no assistants, no paperwork, just appearing in some corner of the vast warehouse and standing there with his hands in his pockets, silently watching. The first time Josie thought he was checking operations like any CEO would. The second time she thought he was watching her, The third time she realized he wasn't looking at the numbers on the wall or the sorting lines, he was looking at her. He watched the way she walked between the shelves and stopped beside the afternoon shift crews, the way she bent her knees or crouched so her eyes were level with theirs when they sat on crates eating lunch, because Josie had learned in 3 years running her old warehouse that people don't open up to someone who stands over them. They open up to someone who meets them on the same level. He watched the way she nodded when she listened, not the performative nod of a manager filling out a form, but the kind of nod that makes the other person keep talking, because they know they're being truly heard. And every time Josie accidentally caught his gaze from a distance, Pax didn't look away. He held her in his eyes for one extra beat before he finally turned and walked elsewhere. And that beat grew a little longer each time, as if he were trying to understand something in her that he hadn't yet found a name for. Then came the rainy night. Josie stayed late to finish a cost analysis for the night shift. And outside, the rain was coming down hard in that late winter Chicago way. Cold rain mixed with wind off Lake Michigan that can cut through skin if you stand in it long enough. When she stepped out of the warehouse door close to 10 at night, pulling her thin coat tight around her, she saw the black Maybach parked at the edge of the lot, beneath a streetlight blurred by the curtain of rain, and a figure standing beside the car. Not Hector, Pax. He stood there, his long coat slick with rain. No umbrella. Collar turned up, but the water still ran down the scar on his jaw and along his neck, and he stood like he'd been there a long time, long enough for the rain to soak through the outer fabric. Josie stopped under the warehouse awning, her heartbeat jumping faster, and she looked at him through the rain. He didn't explain. He didn't say a word. He only waited until she got into the car, the door already opened by Hector on the other side. Then he gave a short nod as if confirming something to himself, turned, climbed into his own vehicle, and drove off ahead. Inside the car, Josie sat very still, listening to the rain strike the roof. Her fingers clamped tight around the edge of her damp coat. She told herself in the strictest voice she had, "He's your boss. He's dangerous. Truly dangerous. Not the kind of danger in a romantic novel, but the kind where people vanish from an employee list, and nobody dares say their name. He belongs to the world of steel doors, with coated locks and trucks that roll in at 2 a.m, a world she wasn't allowed to enter, and shouldn't want to enter. She had 2 children asleep on the south side, in an apartment where the heater ran at half power. 2 children who needed her clear-minded, needed her safe, needed her making decisions with reason, instead of with the too fast pulse beating in her chest at 10 at night in the backseat of a car that wasn't hers. She told herself all of that, and every word was true. But when she closed her eyes, she still saw him standing in the rain without an umbrella, waiting until she was safe before he left, and she knew some thread between them was tightening a little more every day, braided from nameless moments, from glances held 1 beat too long, from a Friday afternoon sitting beside his son, and a rainy night with him waiting in the lot. And Josie knew she should cut that thread right now before it wrapped too tight, but her hand stayed clamped on the wet edge of her coat, and she realized with ruthless honesty that she was no longer sure she wanted to cut it at all. The pounding on the door hit at 1:20 in the morning, and it wasn't the kind of knock you answer. It was the kind of punch, the kind of fist slamming into thin wood with all the weight of drunkenness and desperation. And Josie knew who it was before she was fully awake, because there was only one person in this world who used his knuckles at midnight. She lay there for a second, the cracked ceiling blurring in the dark. Then the second strike landed, and with it came a voice she hadn't heard in 4 years but recognized instantly, because some voices burn into memory through pain, not love. Bryce Calloway, her ex-husband, the man who walked out when her belly was so big she couldn't see her toes, when the 2 babies inside her were fighting to survive, when she lay alone in a hospital bed hearing a doctor say they needed an emergency surgery, and she signed with a shaking hand with no one holding the other side of it. He was outside the door, and he was drunk. Josie rolled out of bed carefully so she wouldn't wake Theo and Margot curled together on the other side. But the third pounding jolted Margot anyway, the little girl jerking upright, thick glasses slipped crooked on the pillow, eyes wide with fear in the dark. And Theo woke right after her, his first reflex reaching for the asthma inhaler beside his pillow, because fear always tightened his chest. Josie spoke fast and low, her voice so steady she surprised herself, telling the kids to go to Martha's room right now. And Martha already had her door open, the 68-year-old woman standing there in her floral nightgown, eyes sharp as if she'd never been asleep at all. And without a word, she gathered both children into her room and locked the door. Josie heard Margot's hiccuping sobs through the door, Martha's rough whisper of comfort, and Theo's wheeze turning heavier than usual. Josie went to the front door. She didn't turn on the light because she didn't want him to see her hands shaking. Through the peephole she saw him, and 4 years hadn't been Bryce Calloway. He was thinner, his face swollen and gray, eyes bloodshot, coat filthy and jeans ripped at the knees, and the stench of cheap liquor and sweat pushed through the thin wooden door. He slammed again, this time with his palm, and he shouted that she owed him, that she'd ruined his life, that if it weren't for those 2 kids, he wouldn't have had to run, wouldn't have had to borrow money from people who were now hunting him across the city. Josie heard every word, and each one cut like a blade, not a new blade, but an old one that had been lodged in her chest for years, and he was simply twisting it deeper. She unlocked the door, opened it, and planted herself in the threshold with both hands braced against the frame. He stared at her, red eyes trying to focus, and Josie saw in those eyes not regret, not love, not any of the things she'd foolishly hoped for in the first months after he vanished. She saw only the selfish desperation of a man who needed money to pay off the very people she'd heard were rivals of the Kensington family, and she understood he hadn't come for her or for the children. He'd come for himself. Like every time. Like always. Like the entire short marriage she'd thought was love, but turned out to be nothing more than a woman's habit of accepting less because she didn't yet know she deserved more. Her hands shook, but her voice didn't when she spoke. You walked out. You don't get to walk back in. Bryce's eyes darkened, his jaw set, and he moved one step too fast for Josie to react. His hand grabbed her collar, twisting the fabric, yanking her close until she smelled cheap bourbon on his breath. And he growled that she didn't get to talk to him like that he was still their father no matter what the court said. Josie didn't scream. She didn't cry. She only looked straight into his eyes with the kind of stare 4 years of raising 2 premature babies alone had forged into steel. But his hand still twisted her collar, and she felt the cloth bite into the skin of her neck. Then her phone slipped out of her nightgown pocket and hit the wooden floor, and the screen flared bright in the dark hallway. On the screen, the phone began to vibrate with an incoming call, and the name that flashed urgently in the dark was Pax Kensington. Bryce looked down, and Josie saw something change on his face. Not instant fear, but the slow recognition of a drunk man as his brain tried to fit pieces together. Kensington, a name anyone tangled in Chicago's underworld knew and feared. His grip loosened halfway. Then from the end of the hallway came a neighbor's shout that he'd called the police, and that shout, combined with the name on the phone screen, was enough. Bryce let go of Josie's collar, backed up 2 steps, looked at her one last time with eyes mixed with hatred and panic, then turned and ran down the stairs, his shoes hammering the steps, the sound fading like a heartbeat cutting out. Josie stood there for a moment, still holding the doorframe with both hands. Then her legs buckled, and she collapsed onto the threshold. Knees pulled to her chest, forehead pressed to her knees, and she didn't cry, not right away. She just sat there breathing, short and shallow the way Theo breathed, when an asthma attack began, and her phone lay on the floor beside her, the screen dark now, but that name still burning in her mind like the trace of light after a lamp has been switched off. The next morning at 6:15, in the office on the top floor of the Kensington Tower, while Chicago beyond the glass was still sunk in that gray light that hadn't yet become day, Hector Vance stood in front of Pax's desk and recounted everything that had happened at the South Side apartment the night before. Hector spoke in a flat, clipped, precise cadence like a military report. From the moment Bryce Calloway appeared at the end of the hallway at 1:17 to the moment he ran down the stairs at 1:32, including the detail of him grabbing Josie's collar and the detail of the phone screen lighting up with the boss's own incoming call as he tried to warn her of the intruder. Josie didn't know this. She didn't know that since the first day she started working at Kensington Holdings, a car had been parked 3 blocks from her apartment every night. Inside it, one of Hector's men, watching who came and went on the stairwell leading to her floor. And it wasn't coincidence or kindness. It was standard procedure. Pax applied to anyone who held sensitive information about how the Empire operated. But Hector had worked for Pax long enough to realize the car outside Josie's apartment had been assigned faster than normal procedure, and the number of guards was higher than necessary for a warehouse manager. Pax listened to the entire report without moving, without interrupting, without changing posture, his hands laced together on the desktop, and his face was so calm it was more frightening than any outburst, because Hector knew when the boss shouted, it meant the boss was still controlling the situation. And when the boss went quiet, it meant someone was about to regret something very deeply. When Hector finished, Pax stayed still for another 10 seconds. Then he spoke 6 words in a voice with no rise or fall, as flat as the ice on Lake Michigan in January. "Find Bryce Calloway. Bring him to me." Hector nodded once, turned, and walked out, and he didn't ask how to handle it because that question would be answered after Bryce was sitting in front of Pax, and Hector had witnessed enough meetings like that to know the outcome depended on what Pax saw in the other man's eyes. Josie arrived at the company at 8 in the morning, crossing the marble lobby with a steadier stride than she felt inside, and around her neck was a wool scarf Martha had wrapped for her before she left home, not for warmth, but because beneath the scarf was a fingertip-shaped bruise where Bryce had twisted her collar the night before, a bruise she'd seen in the mirror that morning and tried to convince herself wasn't as bad as it looked, even though it was exactly as bad as it looked. She hadn't even sat down at her desk when the internal phone rang, and the secretary's voice told her Mr. Kensington wanted to see her immediately. Josie stepped into Pax's office, and the door clicked shut behind her. Pax stood by the window with his back to her, and when he turned to look at her, Josie knew at once that he knew. He knew everything. Those gray-blue eyes flicked once to the scarf at her neck. So fast no one else would have noticed. But Josie did, and she saw something in those eyes tighten, then flare in an instant before it was smothered under calm. He didn't ask about the injury. He didn't ask if she was all right. He didn't say a word about last night, as if it hadn't happened. Instead, he walked to his desk, lifted a cup of coffee already poured and still steaming, and slid it across the polished surface toward her with 2 fingers. Slowly, the way you slide something far more important than a cup of coffee. Then he said, in that low, even voice, that starting tonight someone would drive her and the children, from the apartment to school, from school to the company, from the company back home, every day, and this wasn't a request. It was a decision already made. Josie felt her pride rise like a reflexive wall, the wall she'd built over 4 years of carrying everything alone, the wall that said she didn't need anyone to protect her. She didn't need pity. She'd made it through an emergency C-section with no one holding her hand, so she could make it through this too. She opened her mouth to refuse, but then she looked into Pax's eyes. Really looked, and she didn't see pity. She didn't see a rich man's charity. She saw anger cold and deep like the bottom of Lake Michigan in winter, and that anger wasn't aimed at her. It was aimed at the man who dared to put hands on her, at each finger that had left a bruise on her throat, and she understood this wasn't generosity. It was the controlled fury of a man choosing to protect instead of destroy, even when his instincts leaned the other way. Josie took the coffee cup, both hands wrapping around the hot porcelain, and she couldn't manage anything except a whispered thank you, because this was the first time since the night she lay alone on an operating table at week 30 of pregnancy, the first time in 4 long years, that someone had stepped between her and the darkness and said that from now on the darkness would have to go through him before it could touch her. 3 days later, Martha called Josie at 2 in the afternoon, her voice hoarse and worn, saying she'd come down with a bad cold since morning. She couldn't get out of bed, and she couldn't keep the little ones after school at 3 the way she always did. Josie stood in the middle of the warehouse floor with the rotating shift plan in her hand and felt that familiar helplessness roll in, the feeling every single mother knows, when work and children pull her in opposite directions and she only has one body. She called the preschool to request an early pickup, asked the driver Pax had assigned to take Theo and Margot straight to the Kensington Holdings Tower because she couldn't leave the warehouse while she was supervising a shift handoff, and she texted the lobby receptionist to let the kids wait in the guest seating area. When Josie finished and took the elevator from the warehouse basement up to the main lobby close to 6 in the evening, she stepped out and saw a scene she knew she'd remember for the rest of her life. Theo and Margot sat on the large leather sofa in the lobby, so small their legs dangled a full hand's width above the marble floor, in the vast space of the glass tower lobby where everything was too big, too bright, too expensive compared to the 2 tiny lives pressed close together like sparrows lost inside a palace. Margot was talking, and she was talking to Paxton Kensington. Pax stood in front of the children, still in his tailored suit, still with the faint scar on his jaw and the gray-blue eyes that once made an entire boardroom stop breathing, but his posture was completely different now. He stood a little stiff, arms hanging at his sides like a man who didn't know where to put his hands, and he didn't look like the most powerful boss in Chicago. He looked like a man who'd just been disarmed by a 4-year-old girl in thick glasses. Margot tipped her face up at him, neck craned back because he was so tall, and she asked in a clear, bright voice with no fear at all, with the instinctive boldness of a child who doesn't yet know who she should fear and who she shouldn't. "Can you touch the ceiling, mister?" Josie stopped 10 steps away, and she saw Pax blink once, then look up at the towering lobby ceiling, then back at Margot. And on his face was an expression Josie had never seen before, the look of someone who had no idea what to do, not because the question was difficult, but because his mind didn't contain instructions for answering a 4-year-old asking the simplest question in the world. He'd spent his entire life learning how to command fear from adults, and no one had ever taught him how to speak to a child who wasn't afraid. Then Theo spoke. The boy sat beside his sister with his little backpack on his lap, and while she watched, Josie realized he'd had to use his inhaler because the building air was cold and dry. The inhaler rested in his right hand with a competence that hurt to see. The competence of a 4-year-old who already knew how to spray medicine into his own lungs, as if it were as normal as tying his shoes, and Margot's hand had automatically gone to his back out of reflex, because she was used to helping him settle when the tightness came. Theo looked up at Pax with those big, serious eyes, the rims still a little wet from the medication, and he spoke in a slightly raspy voice, every word clear. "Mommy can't touch the ceiling either, but she reaches the sky because she tries so hard." The lobby was almost empty then, only a few security guards and a receptionist tidying her desk. But Josie swore she felt the enormous space fall 1 degree quieter after her son's words, as if the building itself were listening. Pax looked at Theo, then looked up, and his eyes met Josie's across the 10 steps of open lobby between them. Josie lowered her gaze, because she couldn't bear the force of that look now. Because in those gray-blue eyes she saw what she'd been trying to deny for weeks, something she wasn't ready to name, and yet no longer had the strength to pretend she didn't see. And Pax knew too. Josie understood it not because he said anything, but because he didn't. He only stood there in the glossy marble lobby in front of 2 4-year-olds, with feet that didn't reach the floor, and both adults knew that something had shifted between them. Light as a breath, and yet irreversible, like a crack in ice that once it's there, no winter can seal again. 2 weeks after the night Bryce showed up, an emergency operations failure hit at 10 at night when the automated sorting system in Zone B malfunctioned in the middle of processing the largest shipment of the quarter. The line stopped dead. Hundreds of parcels jammed on the conveyor, and the night shift began to panic because everyone knew late freight meant lost money, and lost money meant someone would be held responsible in a way that, at Kensington Holdings, nobody ever wanted to be held responsible. Josie was at home when the call came. She told Martha to watch the kids, got in her car, and drove hard to the warehouse. And when she arrived, Pax was already there, standing in the middle of the floor, in a rolled-sleeve dress shirt and leather shoes dusted with concrete powder, issuing clipped orders to the technical team in a voice that made everyone move twice as fast. They worked side by side for 3 hours. Josie coordinated workers to shift freight onto a manual lane, while Pax handled calls with customers and suppliers. And in those 3 hours, there was no boss and employee, no distance, only 2 people keeping a ship from sinking. And Josie realized it was the first time she'd seen Pax truly work with his hands instead of only with commands. The way he rolled his sleeves up without flinching at grime, the way he called each technician by name, with such precision, it was as if he remembered every person in his empire, even though he'd never let anyone see that. When the failure was resolved, and the warehouse returned to its normal rhythm close to 1 in the morning, Josie stepped out onto the rooftop balcony to breathe, because her lungs needed air, and her mind needed space. Chicago spread below like a carpet of light, millions of pinpricks blinking all the way to the horizon where the city met the dark edge of Lake Michigan. And the night wind was cold but not cutting, cold enough to remind her she was still alive after 3 hours of strain. She heard footsteps behind her, and didn't have to turn to know who it was, because she'd learned his stride without even realizing when. Pax stood beside her. They both faced the skyline, saying nothing, and the distance between her arm and his slowly narrowed until it was only 1 step. Maybe less. Josie didn't dare look down to measure. The air between them thickened, heavier than the wind, heavier than the smell of concrete and machine oil still clinging to their clothes, and Josie felt the pull as clearly as gravity, a nameless force drawing from him to her across that 1 step of space, tilting her toward him even as her mind screamed every reason to stay still. She thought of Theo asleep with the inhaler by his pillow. She thought of Margot curled like a small cat. She thought of the 3 steel doors with coated locks at the end of the warehouse corridor, and the trucks that rolled in at 2 in the morning. She thought of all of it, and she took one step back. Only one step, but it reopened space that a second ago had almost ceased to exist. Pax didn't look at her, his eyes still on the skyline, but Josie saw his jaw tighten, then release, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than the wind. That's the right call. 4 words. Calm. Correct. But Josie stood there, watching his profile in the city glow, and she saw his eyes say the opposite. They said he didn't want her to step back, that her retreat was right, and he hated it. Hated the distance it created. And he would never admit that out loud because he was Paxton Kensington, and admitting anything meant giving someone power over him. And that was something he never did. Josie turned and left the balcony, passed through the glass door back inside, and her heart was beating so hard she could hear it, in her ears, in her throat, in her chest, everywhere. And she knew, with the ruthless clarity of someone who could no longer lie to herself, that she was falling in love with the most dangerous man she'd ever met. And her step back on the balcony tonight wasn't because she didn't want to step closer. It was because she wanted it too much. And that depth of wanting was what frightened her more than any coated steel door ever could. It happened on a normal Saturday afternoon, normal in a way that felt almost cruel. Josie was in the kitchen getting lunch ready. Martha sat in the armchair by the window, knitting, while Theo and Margot played in the small yard in front of the apartment, a cracked concrete patch where someone had set down an old plastic swing, and the 2 little ones treated it like their private paradise. Margot was pushing the swing for Theo, and through the kitchen window Josie saw her son laughing, the laugh raspy because his lungs never allowed him to laugh too loud. But the smile was as wide as it could possibly be, and that was the last image she saw before the world collapsed. She turned back to the stove for exactly 3 minutes to stir the pasta sauce, and when she looked out again, the swing was moving empty. Margot stood alone in the middle of the yard, her face drained white, her arms hanging at her sides, her mouth open but no sound coming out, as if she was screaming inside a dream with the volume turned off. Josie ran outside, and when she dropped to her knees, grabbed Margot's shoulders, and demanded where her brother was, the girl finally made a sound, not words but a raw cry ripped from the bottom of her belly. And inside that cry Josie caught 3 broken words. The man took Theo. Josie would never forget the next moment. The moment her whole body froze from the inside as if someone had poured liquid nitrogen into her veins, then melted into the purest panic she'd ever known. Martha was suddenly out in the yard, holding Margot tight, while dialing 911 with hands shaking so badly she hit the wrong number twice, her voice choking as she told the dispatcher that a man had picked up a 4-year-old boy, put him in a car, and driven away. Josie knew it was Bryce before Margot even described him, because there was no one else desperate enough and stupid enough to snatch his own son after a federal custody order stripped him of every right more than 3 years ago, after he'd run and never bothered to show up for a single hearing. And what he'd done now wasn't a custody dispute. It was child abduction under federal law, a charge heavy enough to buy decades in prison. But Josie wasn't thinking about the law then. She wasn't thinking about charges or courtrooms. She was thinking about Theo, her son, the baby born 3 months early who once lay inside an incubator with a breathing tube smaller than her pinky finger. The child with weak lungs who couldn't run fast, the child who carried an asthma inhaler everywhere. And that inhaler was sitting on the swing seat outside, because Theo hadn't had time to grab it before he was taken. And Josie pictured her son struggling to breathe in a car with a drunk man who wouldn't know what to do when the wheezing hit, and the picture nearly made her collapse right there on the concrete. But she didn't collapse. She yanked out her phone with hands shaking so hard she had to use both thumbs to hit the right contact, and she called Pax. It rang twice and he picked up, and Josie heard her own voice through the line, a voice she didn't recognize because it sounded thin and cracked and desperate enough to make her hate it, but she didn't have time to hate anything now. "Please," she whispered. "My son." 2 words, "my son," and she heard silence on the other end. Not the silence of someone thinking, but the silence of someone who had already decided before her sentence finished. Then a click, and Pax ended the call without saying a single word. Josie stared at the dark screen, and for the first time in her life, she placed her child's entire life in a man's hands, and that man was the one the world called a monster. The next 2 hours were the longest 2 hours of Josephine Calloway's life. Longer than 20 hours of premature labor. Longer than 3 months staring at her babies through incubator glass. Longer than every sleepless night counting rent money combined. She sat on the kitchen floor, holding Margot, and Margot clung back with small arms so tight they left red marks on her mother's skin, and the two of them didn't speak. They only sat there breathing, waiting, and with every minute that passed, Josie died a little. Then the doorbell rang. Josie opened the door, and Hector Vance stood there in his familiar black coat, his face expressionless as always, but on his left shoulder, head tucked against Hector's neck, was Theo, fast asleep, small arms loosely looped around the big man's neck, and the boy wasn't hurt. Not a scratch. Only dried tear tracks on his cheeks. His breathing still a little heavy but steady. Josie reached out for her child, and when Theo's warm, familiar weight shifted from Hector's shoulder into her arms, her legs gave out, and she sank right onto the threshold, cradling her son against her chest, her face buried in his hair, and she cried without sound, her body shaking but making no noise because she didn't want to wake him. Hector stood there a moment, then said, in the briefest tone, that Bryce Calloway had been found in an abandoned warehouse on the west side of the city. He was alive. He wasn't seriously injured, but he would not be coming back to Chicago again, ever. And the weight Hector put on the word ever carried something absolute, something Josie understood she shouldn't ask about. She didn't ask. She didn't ask what Bryce endured during those 2 hours. She didn't ask how they found him. She didn't ask what he saw in that abandoned warehouse that ensured he would never dare set foot in Chicago again. And Pax didn't explain. It was an unspoken pact between them, signed in silence on the threshold of the South Side apartment, where Josie held her son and understood that darkness had protected her child, and she accepted that not because she agreed with the darkness, but because when your child is in danger, you don't have the luxury of judging the hand that brings them back. After Hector left, Josie locked the door, carried Theo to the bed beside Margot, the little girl already asleep in Martha's arms from crying too much, and Josie laid the 2 children close together, pulled the blanket up to their chests, set Theo's inhaler right beside his pillow out of habit, then stood there watching them breathe in the dark for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe longer. She didn't count. She only stood there listening to their breathing, because today she had almost lost that sound forever and she needed to hear it long enough to believe it was real. Then she went back to the kitchen, sat down on the cold tile floor with her back against the cabinets, and she cried. Not the silent crying she'd trained into routine over 4 years so the kids wouldn't hear. This time she cried until her shoulders shook, until her stomach clenched, until tears ran down her chin and soaked her shirt, and she didn't even wipe them because she didn't have the strength to wipe anything. She cried for the last 2 hours, for the fear that had chewed through her from the inside while she sat on this same kitchen floor holding Margot and waiting, for the moment she pictured Theo unable to breathe in Bryce's car without an inhaler, for all the nights before when she wouldn't let herself cry, because if she cried, then who would be strong for the 2 little ones? Martha came out of the bedroom slowly because her knees were old, and she didn't say a word. She only lowered herself onto the floor beside Josie, back against the same cabinets, and put a hand on Josie's back, a warm, wrinkled hand resting still between Josie's shoulder blades. No rubbing, no patting, just resting there, because Martha had lived long enough to know that sometimes people don't need comfort spoken. They only need to know someone is sitting beside them on a cold kitchen floor at midnight. Josie didn't know how long she cried. Maybe half an hour, maybe longer, until the tears truly ran dry and she was left sitting there breathing hard with swollen, burning eyes. Then the doorbell rang, softly, only once, as if the person pressing it knew there were children asleep inside and didn't want to wake them. Martha looked at Josie. Josie looked at Martha. Then she stood on legs that still trembled, walked to the door, peered through the peephole, and her heart stopped for 1 beat. Paxton Kensington stood in the 3rd-floor hallway of the South Side building, surrounded by peeling paint, a flickering fluorescent ceiling light, cracked tile, and the damp smell of old pipes, and he stood there in a charcoal 3-piece suit, tie still tight, shoes still polished, so out of place it was almost absurd, like someone had cut him out of a Forbes cover and pasted him into a mural of a poor block, and the image was both impossible and beautiful, in a way Josie couldn't stop herself from noticing. He didn't step inside. He stayed at the threshold with his arms at his sides, and in his right hand he held a small box. He offered it to her and said it was a backup inhaler for Theo, a newer kind, faster acting, and he'd called his private doctor for the prescription. Josie looked down at the box in his hand, at the long, strong fingers holding something so small, with a care she'd never seen him give anything else, and something inside her, something she'd been holding up with sheer will for weeks. That wall built from pride and reason and fear collapsed in 1 second. She didn't think. She stepped forward, 1 step, and her forehead rested against his chest. And she cried again, even though she thought she'd emptied herself on the kitchen floor. But it turned out there are different kinds of tears. The kitchen floor tears were fear. These were something else, because for the first time, someone stood at her door at midnight not to demand money or pound a fist into the wood, but to bring her child medicine. Pax went rigid. His whole body locked as if someone had poured concrete into his spine, and Josie felt it through her forehead against his chest. She felt his heart beating far faster than normal, even though from the outside he looked like a statue. And she understood he wasn't rigid because he didn't want this. He was rigid because he didn't know how. He didn't know what to do when a woman leaned into him and cried, because maybe no one had done that to him in a very long time, or maybe no one ever had. Then, slowly, so slowly, Josie could feel each millimeter of movement. One of his hands lifted and settled on her back. Light, heavy only with the weight of a hand and nothing more, as if he was afraid that if he pressed harder she would break. Or maybe he would. How long they stood there, Josie didn't know, on the threshold between a hallway of peeling paint and a small kitchen, between his world and hers. And Martha watched from inside, then quietly turned and went back to her room, because she knew some moments aren't meant for witnesses. When Josie finally stepped back with eyes swollen and red, she walked out into the hallway, and the two of them sat down on the steps outside the apartment, under flickering fluorescent light, and the sound of a pipe dripping somewhere inside the wall. And Pax spoke. For the first time he spoke not in a commanding voice or a CEO voice, or the voice of a boss controlling everything, but in the weary voice of a 36-year-old man who'd carried a lie for too long. "My mother taught me mercy was a luxury power couldn't afford," he said, eyes on the steps, "and I believed her for 36 years. He paused, then lifted his face, and for the first time Josie saw those gray-blue eyes with no armor in front of them, bare and tired and real enough to steal her breath. "Then you walked into my boardroom, and I realized I'd wasted 36 years believing the wrong thing." Josie sat beside him on the steps of that worn-out Southside building and told the truth in a rasp from too many tears. "I can't fix you." It wasn't rejection, and it wasn't cruelty. It was the truth she owed him and owed herself, because she couldn't fix a man built from darkness. She had 2 children who needed her whole, and she couldn't burn herself down to keep someone else warm. Pax looked at her, and there was no smile on his mouth, but there was something softer than anything she'd ever seen on that face. "I'm not asking you to fix me," he said. "I'm asking you not to leave." And Josie sat there on the peeling steps beside the most powerful Mafia boss in Chicago, listening to the pipe drip inside the wall and the low hum of the city far away. And she didn't say yes, she didn't say no. She only let her shoulder touch his shoulder, lightly, and she didn't leave. 6 months after that night on the steps, the Kensington Holdings distribution center looked like a completely different place, even though not a single wall had been repainted and not a single machine had been replaced. What changed was the people. The rotating shift system Josie implemented cut consecutive night stretches exactly the way the original plan promised. The temporary restroom for long-haul drivers ran at full capacity with clean beds, warm blankets, and hot coffee. The Employee Family Support Program rolled out from expanded health coverage for children to emergency paid days off, and the numbers didn't lie. Turnover dropped by more than 20% compared to the same period the year before, saving the company millions in recruiting and training costs the board once treated as unavoidable. Productivity rose steadily month after month, not because anyone was forced, but because people do better work when they don't hate the place they have to show up to every morning. Workplace accidents fell to the lowest point in the company's entire history, because Josie read every safety report and found the gaps the people before her either couldn't be bothered to see or didn't dare to see. Reggie, the worker who'd whispered to her about trucks arriving at 2 a.m. on her first day, was now a shift lead everyone respected. And one afternoon when Josie passed through the loading area, he stopped her, looked at her with the eyes of a man who'd spent 20 years looking down and was finally allowed to lift his head, and said that for the first time in 2 decades, he felt his life was worth more than the freight on the trucks. Josie only nodded and smiled. But when she turned away, she had to blink fast to keep tears from falling on the warehouse floor, because some sentences touched the deepest reason she did all of this. Pax watched everything from a distance the way he always did, showing up unannounced, standing in some corner and watching Josie run the thing he built, but had never known how to run on anything except fear, and little by little he started making decisions that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. He met with his private attorneys to outline a plan to separate Kensington Holdings' legitimate operation from the underworld network, a complex and dangerous process that required cutting thread by thread what 3 generations had braided together. But Pax began with the simplest piece. He ordered an end to every truck that wasn't on the schedule at the distribution center Josie managed. And when Hector asked if he was sure, Pax said that the place she worked would be clean, each word deliberate, and Hector didn't ask again. Rumors of the change reached Lake Forest faster than the wind. Orla Kensington, 65, her platinum hair cut short and sharp, lived alone in the family estate overlooking Lake Michigan, the woman who built the foundation of this empire beside her late husband, and kept controlling it from behind the curtain after he died, and her son took the throne. The mother who taught Pax everything he knew about power, including the lesson that mercy was a luxury a ruler could never afford. She summoned Pax on a Sunday evening, and when he entered the living room with a 20-foot ceiling and a fire burning, Orla sat in her familiar armchair by the window facing the dark lawn sloping down to the lake. She didn't turn when her son walked in, and she said she'd heard about the changes at the distribution center, about the separation plan, about the girl from the South Side. And she said the girl was making him weak, that the Kensington family didn't survive 3 generations on kindness, that his father died to protect what they built, and now Pax was dismantling it for a single mother with pretty eyes. Her voice wasn't angry. It was colder than anger. The cold of someone who cut out emotion long ago and called the absence strength. Pax stood in the middle of the living room, the firelight throwing a shadow across the scar on his jaw, and he looked at his mother, the woman who gave birth to him, and also shaped him into the thing he was now trying to peel away layer by layer. And for the first time in 36 years, Paxton Kensington didn't bow his head to Orla Kensington. He didn't raise his voice. Not at all. Because he was her son, and he'd learned that the softer the voice, the greater the power. But he spoke straight into her eyes with a steadiness like forged steel. You call it weakness. He paused, and in that pause, Josie was on the south side feeding Theo and Margot dinner, without knowing that 30 miles away a man was standing in front of his mother fighting for her. I call it the only reason any of this is worth building. Orla stared at her son, and in those old ice-sharp eyes something moved. Not agreement, not yet, but maybe astonishment. Or maybe the faint memory of a very distant time, when she too believed in something soft, before life taught her that softness meant death, and Pax saw that memory flare and go dark again in her gaze. But he didn't need her approval. He only needed her to know he had chosen. And no power, not even the power of the woman who birthed him, would change that. 1 year after the night, Pax stood in front of his mother in Lake Forest. Kensington Holdings recorded record profits from its legitimate business, beating every forecast from the financial markets, and proving to the entire logistics industry that an empire can stand without using darkness as its foundation. The annual review ceremony was held in the largest auditorium in Chicago. Thousands of employees from every distribution center across the Midwest packed the rows of seats, and when Paxton Kensington walked onto the stage beneath the bright lights and thunderous applause, he didn't look like the boss Josie met on the Michigan Avenue sidewalk a year ago. He was still tall. The faint scar still marked his jaw. He still carried those gray-blue eyes that could silence a room. But something had shifted at the outermost edge of that face. The hardness hadn't disappeared. Not entirely, but it had softened just enough that anyone paying attention could see it. He stood at the microphone without notes, without a prepared script, and he spoke in that same low voice, only now it carried the weight of a man speaking from lived experience instead of theory. He said success isn't built from fear or profit-maximizing algorithms, that for 3 generations of his family he believed power was everything, but the past year proved that power without people's hearts is nothing but an empty shell waiting to collapse. That every record number celebrated today didn't come from forcing people to do more. It came from making people want to stay because they felt they mattered. He said real success is built by people who choose to care about each other. And that sentence rang through the auditorium, then fell into a beat of silence before the applause broke like thunder. Pax looked down at the front row, and Josie sat there in new clothes that didn't come from a thrift store, and beside her were Theo and Margot and Flynn. 3 children sat pressed together on the red velvet seats. Theo and Margot's feet still dangled above the floor because the auditorium chairs were too high, and Margot leaned over to straighten Theo's glasses, because they were crooked, with the natural ease of an older sister who'd been caring for her brother since they both lay in incubators. And Flynn sat beside Margot, bending close to explain how to clap on the beat because Margot was off rhythm, patiently guiding a 5-year-old with a 9-year-old's adorable seriousness that made Josie bite her lip to keep from laughing. The 4 children sat together as if they'd belonged to each other long before the adults noticed, and Josie looked at them, then looked up at the stage, and her eyes met Pax's across the distance between the front row and the stage lights. Pax gave her a small nod, discreet and brief, a nod no one in the crowd of thousands would notice, but Josie noticed, because she'd learned to read this man through the smallest signals. She nodded back, eyes wet, not crying but right at the edge of it, because she remembered the girl on that sidewalk a year ago with a thrift store vest and a broken heart, and she couldn't believe that girl and the woman sitting here now were the same person. That night there was no rooftop restaurant and no expensive wine. That night there was pasta. The new apartment was bigger and brighter than the old Southside studio. In a safer neighborhood, Josie knew Pax had quietly arranged, but never claimed as his, and she never asked because they'd learned how to give and receive without labeling it. And in that apartment, Josie made pasta with tomato sauce for Martha and the 3 children. Flynn stayed for dinner, and he laughed, really laughed. Not the polite, too-old smile Josie saw the first time in Pax's office, but a laugh that burst out of him when Margot got tomato sauce on the tip of her nose, then squinted down, trying to see it through thick lenses, making a face so funny that even Theo laughed along while he coughed lightly, and Flynn laughed, and Martha laughed, and the small kitchen trembled with the laughter of 3 children and 1 old woman. Pax arrived late. He stood at the door, still in his suit, still with those gray-blue eyes, but he stood there looking inside, looking at 3 children around the table with tomato sauce on their faces, looking at Martha lifting a cloth to wipe Margot's nose, looking at Josie by the stove in an apron with a wooden spoon in her hand. And on his face was the expression of a man standing in front of something none of his empires could buy. Martha looked up, saw him there, and she spoke in a voice with no reverence for bosses or billionaires or titles, because Martha was 68 and had lived long enough not to fear anyone. Get in here before it gets cold. And Paxton Kensington, the man all of Chicago once feared, the man who built an empire on blood and fear, the man whose own mother taught him mercy was a luxury, stepped over the threshold of a small apartment like an ordinary man allowed, for the first time in his life, to come home. Weeks later, on a weekend afternoon, Josie walked along the same stretch of Michigan Avenue sidewalk, where everything began. Her left hand held Margot's, her right hand held Theo's. The boy walked more steadily than a year ago, even though he still carried his inhaler in a small backpack, and Pax walked beside them with Flynn on his shoulders, because the boy complained his legs were tired, though Josie suspected he only wanted his dad to carry him, and Pax suspected he liked carrying his son more than he ever thought he would. The wind off Lake Michigan swept down the avenue, still cold, still carrying that Great Lakes bite, but it didn't cut through Josie anymore, because she wore a warm coat, and beside her were hands holding hers, and ahead of her was a road she no longer had to walk alone. She remembered the girl who stood here a year ago with a worn document bag under her arm, rent 14 days overdue, an inhaler she needed to buy for her child and not enough money, and the sound of footsteps behind her that changed everything. Life isn't magic. Pax was still a man with darkness attached. The scar on his jaw still sat there like a reminder of a past you can't erase, and the road ahead still held turns neither of them could see yet. But on that sidewalk, in that moment, 3 children were laughing, and 2 adults were choosing to walk toward the light. And sometimes that is enough. Josie and Pax's story isn't only a love story between a single mother and a powerful boss. It's a reminder that behind every resume gap, there's a human being carrying something heavier than any job, that kindness isn't weakness. It's the rarest form of courage, that sometimes all someone needs to change their entire life is one person believing they deserve a chance. If this story touched your heart, please like and share this video with someone you believe needs to hear it today. And if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, subscribe now so meaningful stories like this can reach you every day. We want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in real life? Which moment touched you the deepest? Write it in the comments below because we read every line, and every share from your heart is the greatest motivation for us to keep telling stories like this. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Thank you for staying with us to the final minute. Goodbye. and I'll see you in the next video.